October 21, 1990, Suzuka Circuit in Japan, a track already known for deciding championships. But on that specific day, it would become the stage for one of the most shocking and controversial moments in the entire history of Formula One. A moment that would not only define a title, but would also expose the psychological intensity and personal conflict between two of the greatest drivers the sport has ever seen. Ayrton Senna, already recognized for his aggressive driving style and absolute commitment to victory, approached Turn 1 at a speed exceeding 250 kilometers per hour with Alain Prost directly ahead of him. Knowing that the championship would likely be decided in that very instant, and instead of choosing the conventional path of braking, calculating, and attempting a clean move, he made a decision that stunned the world. He kept accelerating, fully aware of the consequences, and fully committed to an outcome that had been building for an entire year. Because this story does not begin in 1990, it begins in Suzuka 1989, when Senna and Prost were still teammates at McLaren, driving the most dominant car on the grid, yet operating under an environment that was anything but harmonious, as internal tension, strategic disagreements, and growing mistrust transformed what should have been a dominant partnership into one of the most intense rivalries the sport had ever experienced. Throughout that season, their relationship deteriorated race after race, fueled by differences in personality and philosophy, with Senna relying on instinct and aggression while Prost approached every situation with calculated precision and long-term strategy, creating a clash that extended far beyond the track. By the time they arrived in Japan, both drivers knew the championship would be decided between them, and neither was willing to compromise. As the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix unfolded, the atmosphere at Suzuka became increasingly tense, with every lap carrying the weight of an entire season filled with rivalry, internal conflict, and unspoken hostility between two drivers who were supposed to represent the same team. Ayrton Senna entered the race knowing that victory was his only path to keeping the championship alive, while Alain Prost understood that a more controlled and calculated approach could be enough to secure the title without unnecessary risk. This fundamental difference in mindset shaped the way both drivers approached every corner, every braking zone, and every opportunity that presented itself on track. Senna pushed harder, attacking relentlessly, searching for any opening that could allow him to take control of the race, while Prost focused on positioning, defending intelligently, and managing the situation with the experience of someone who understood the bigger picture. As the race progressed, both drivers naturally gravitated to the front, exactly where the championship battle demanded them to be, and the tension that had been building all season reached its absolute peak. It was no longer a question of strategy or team coordination, but of individual will, instinct, and the refusal to yield under pressure, creating a scenario where a decisive moment was not just possible, but inevitable. That decisive moment arrived as both drivers approached the final chicane, with the race, and effectively the championship, hanging in the balance of a single decision made in a fraction of a second. Ayrton Senna, true to his nature, saw an opportunity on the inside line, a narrow gap that required absolute commitment, and without hesitation he positioned his car to make the move, fully aware that backing out was no longer an option. Alain Prost, equally aware of the situation and what was at stake, reacted by closing the door, defending his position with precision and intent. And in that exact instant the inevitable occurred. The two McLarens collided, locking together and bringing the race to a dramatic halt. For Prost, the outcome was immediately clear, as both cars being out of contention would secure him the championship, and with that understanding he stepped out of the car, calm and composed, accepting the situation as final. Senna, however, refused to see it that way, because for him the race was not over, not yet, and what followed would reveal the depth of his determination and his refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. Determined to continue, Ayrton Senna signaled to the marshals and managed to restart his car, despite the damage caused by the collision, rejoining the race with a singular focus on recovering what he believed was still possible. At that moment, logic suggested that his chances were gone, that the damage, the lost time, and the circumstances would prevent any realistic comeback. But Senna operated under a different mindset, one that rejected limitation and embraced the possibility of overcoming the impossible. Lap after lap, he pushed the car to its limits, overtaking competitors with precision and aggression, steadily climbing back through the field in a performance that combined technical skill with raw determination. The crowd watched as what initially seemed like a lost race transformed into one of the most remarkable recovery drives in Formula One history, as Senna closed the gap to the leaders and eventually reclaimed the position at the front. When he crossed the finish line in first place, the message appeared clear: on track, he had won the race against all odds, turning a moment of chaos into a statement of resilience and competitive spirit. However, Formula One has never been governed solely by what happens on the track, and while Senna celebrated what he believed to be a legitimate victory, the situation was already being evaluated by race officials, who were reviewing the events that had unfolded during the collision and the subsequent rejoining of the race. The decision that followed would become one of the most controversial rulings in the history of the sport, as Senna was disqualified not for causing the collision itself, but for cutting the chicane while re-entering the track, a technical violation that, according to the regulations, justified the penalty. For many observers, the ruling felt disconnected from the reality of the race, ignoring the context and the circumstances under which Senna had continued. But for the governing body, the application of the rule was clear and final. As a result, Alain Prost was declared the winner of the championship, not through direct on-track victory in that moment, but through the enforcement of regulations that reshaped the outcome after the fact, leaving a sense of unresolved tension in the sport. For Ayrton Senna, the disqualification represented far more than a lost race or a missed championship. It was perceived as a fundamental injustice, a moment where the integrity of competition had been compromised by decisions made outside the track. In the days and weeks that followed, he spoke openly about his frustration, questioning not only the ruling itself but the broader system that allowed such an outcome to occur, bringing attention to the political dimensions of Formula One that often remained hidden behind the spectacle of racing. His stance was direct and uncompromising, placing him in conflict with the governing authorities and escalating the situation beyond a simple sporting disagreement. This marked a turning point in his career and in his rivalry with Alain Prost, transforming what had been an intense competitive relationship into something deeply personal and emotionally charged. By the time the 1990 season began, the dynamic had completely changed. Prost had moved to Ferrari, and the two drivers were no longer constrained by team orders or shared objectives, setting the stage for a confrontation that would return to Suzuka, where everything had started, and where, this time, Senna would ensure that the outcome would not be decided anywhere other than on the track itself. As the 1990 Formula One season began, the entire dynamic between Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost had fundamentally changed, transforming what was once an internal team rivalry into a full-scale battle between two opposing forces representing different teams, different environments, and different motivation. Prost had left McLaren and joined Ferrari, bringing with him not only his experience and precision but also a renewed sense of purpose, as he now had the opportunity to challenge Senna from outside the structure that had once tried to contain both drivers under the same roof. Senna, on the other hand, remained at McLaren, now positioned as the undisputed leader of the team, with full support and a clear objective: to reclaim the championship that he believed had been taken from him the year before. From the very first races of the season, it became evident that this was not going to be a normal title fight, as both drivers approached every weekend with an intensity that went beyond competition and entered the realm of personal redemption and unfinished business. Every overtake, every qualifying lap, and every strategic decision carried the weight of what had happened in 1989, creating an atmosphere where the past was constantly influencing the present. As the 1990 Formula One season began, the entire dynamic between Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost had fundamentally changed, transforming what was once an internal team rivalry into a full-scale battle between two opposing forces representing different teams, different environments, and different motivation. Prost had left McLaren and joined Ferrari, bringing with him not only his experience and precision but also a renewed sense of purpose, as he now had the opportunity to challenge Senna from outside the structure that had once tried to contain both drivers under the same roof. Senna, on the other hand, remained at McLaren, now positioned as the undisputed leader of the team, with full support and a clear objective: to reclaim the championship that he believed had been taken from him the year before. From the very first races of the season, it became evident that this was not going to be a normal title fight, as both drivers approached every weekend with an intensity that went beyond competition and entered the realm of personal redemption and unfinished business. Every overtake, every qualifying lap, and every strategic decision carried the weight of what had happened in 1989, creating an atmosphere where the past was constantly influencing the present. As the season moved into its final phase, the championship standings tightened, and once again, all roads began to lead towards Suzuka, the same circuit that had decided the title the previous year and the same place where both drivers had unfinished business. The anticipation surrounding the Japanese Grand Prix grew with each passing race, as fans, teams, and media recognized the possibility that history could repeat itself in a way that would be even more dramatic than before. Senna arrived in Japan leading the championship, but the margin was not enough to guarantee the title without a strong result, while Prost knew that victory could shift the balance in his favor, setting up a direct confrontation between the two once again. The context was almost identical, but the emotions were amplified, shaped by everything that had happened before, creating a scenario where the pressure was not just about winning a race, but about resolving a conflict that had been building for over a year. One of the most critical elements leading into the race weekend was the position of the starting grid, particularly the pole position, which at Suzuka was located on the racing line that offered a significant advantage heading into the first corner. Senna secured pole position during qualifying, delivering a performance that reinforced his status as the fastest driver on the circuit. But what followed introduced a new layer of controversy even before the race had begun. Senna requested that the pole position be moved to the cleaner side of the track, arguing that the existing placement put him at a disadvantage due to the accumulation of rubber on the racing line for the second grid slot. His request was denied by the race officials, a decision that, in his mind, echoed the events of 1989 and reinforced his belief that the system was not neutral. This moment, while seemingly technical, had a profound psychological impact, as it contributed to a growing sense of frustration and distrust that would influence his mindset going into the race. From that point forward, the narrative of Suzuka 1990 was no longer just about speed, strategy, or even the championship itself. It became about perception, control, and the belief that external factors were shaping the outcome before the race had even started. Senna internalized the situation, interpreting the decision not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern that had begun the previous year, and this interpretation began to influence the way he approached the race mentally. For him, the idea of leaving the result in the hands of officials or regulations was no longer acceptable, and the concept of taking control of the situation, regardless of the risk, started to take form. Prost, meanwhile, focused on execution, aware of the tension but committed to his own strategy, understanding that his best chance lay in a clean start and a controlled race. As both drivers prepared for the start, the contrast in mindset became critical, one driven by calculation and patience, the other by emotion and the desire to reclaim control over the narrative. As the cars lined up on the grid for the start of the Japanese Grand Prix, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation, with every individual involved in the sport aware that something significant was about to happen, even if no one could predict exactly how it would unfold. Senna sat on pole position, focused yet carrying the weight of the past, while Prost positioned himself alongside, ready to capitalize on any advantage from the start. The lights prepared to go out, and in that brief moment of silence before the race began, everything that had happened in 1989, every decision, every disagreement, and every unresolved emotion converged into a single point in time. This was no longer just a race. It was the culmination of a rivalry, a test of philosophy, and a moment where one decision could define everything that followed. And as the lights went out and the cars launched forward, the world watched as two drivers accelerated toward turn one, knowing that what happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments in the history of Formula One. As the lights went out at Suzuka in 1990, both Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost reacted instantly, launching off the grid with precision as the entire field accelerated toward the first corner. But the focus of the world was fixed on the front row, where the championship battle would begin to unfold in real time. Prost, starting from the cleaner side of the track, gained a slight advantage off the line, his Ferrari finding more traction as he edged ahead of Senna within the first few meters, positioning himself on the racing line as they approached turn one at rapidly increasing speed. Senna, however, did not lift, did not hesitate, and did not adjust his trajectory, maintaining full commitment as he closed the gap between them with absolute determination. In that moment, everything that had happened over the past year, every disagreement, every decision, and every perceived injustice converged into a single action, one that would define not only the race but the legacy of both drivers. Prost moved to defend his position, following the natural racing line into the corner, while Senna remained on the inside, carrying speed and refusing to yield. The distance between the two cars disappeared in an instant, and in that fraction of a second the outcome became inevitable, as Senna's McLaren collided with Prost's Ferrari at high speed, sending both cars off the track and into the gravel, ending their race before the first corner had even been completed. The impact was immediate and violent, with both cars sliding uncontrollably through the gravel trap, their momentum carrying them away from the circuit as debris scattered, and the hopes of a conventional championship battle vanished in an instant. For a brief moment there was silence, a collective pause as spectators, commentators, and teams processed what had just occurred, trying to understand whether it had been a racing incident, a miscalculation, or something far more deliberate. Prost, realizing the situation almost instantly, understood that with both drivers out of the race, the championship would not be his, and that realization carried a different kind of weight, one that reflected the finality of the moment. Senna, on the other hand, remained in the car for a few seconds, fully aware of what had just happened, fully aware of the consequence, and yet seemingly at peace with the outcome. This was not a moment of surprise for him. It was the execution of a decision that had been forming long before the race had even started. The race continued without them, but in reality, the defining moment had already passed, as the championship had effectively been decided within seconds of the start. As the cameras replayed the incident from multiple angles, the debate began immediately, with analysts, commentators, and former drivers offering different interpretations of what had taken place, some describing it as an unavoidable racing incident, while others suggested that Senna's actions had gone beyond the boundaries of fair competition. The key detail that stood out was the absence of any visible attempt to avoid the collision, as Senna had maintained his line and speed despite Prost's position ahead, reinforcing the perception that the contact had been, at the very least, accepted as a possibility. For many, this raised a critical question. Was this simply a consequence of two drivers refusing to yield, or was it a calculated decision influenced by the events of the previous year? The comparison to Suzuka 1989 was unavoidable, as both incidents involved the same corner, the same drivers, and a championship on the line. but the difference in context made the 1990 collision far more controversial, as it appeared to reflect a shift in intent rather than circumstance. Within the McLaren garage, the reaction was complex, as the team had effectively secured the championship through Senna's position in the standings, but the manner in which it had been achieved raised questions that extended beyond the result itself. Team members understood the competitive mindset required to reach the highest level of motorsport, yet even within that environment, the nature of the collision challenged the traditional boundaries of racing conduct. Across the paddock, reactions varied, with some drivers expressing understanding of Senna's perspective, acknowledging the intensity of the rivalry and the influence of the previous season, while others viewed the incident as crossing a line that should not be crossed under any circumstances. Prost, speaking after the race, was measured but firm, suggesting that the collision had not been accidental, and reinforcing the idea that the championship had been decided through an act that went beyond racing. The narrative was no longer just about what happened, but about why it happened. In the days that followed, the discussion only intensified, as media coverage expanded the debate beyond the immediate context of the race, turning it into a broader conversation about ethics, competition, and the limits of what should be considered acceptable in Formula One. Senna, initially reserved in his comments, later acknowledged that his actions had been influenced by the events of 1989, admitting that he had made a conscious decision not to yield at the first corner, a statement that added a new dimension to the incident and confirmed what many had already suspected. For his supporters, this admission reinforced the idea that he had taken control of his destiny in a sport where external decisions had previously influenced the outcome, while for his critics, it validated concerns that the integrity of competition had been compromised. The incident at Suzuka in 1990 was no longer just a moment in a race. It had become a defining example of the complex relationship between ambition, justice, and morality in elite motorsport. Despite the controversy, the official result stood, and Ayrton Senna was crowned world champion, securing his second title in Formula One. But unlike many championships, this one carried a narrative that could not be separated from the way it had been achieved. For some, it was the ultimate demonstration of determination and mental strength, a driver refusing to be denied after what he perceived as injustice, while for others, it represented a moment where the desire to win had overridden the fundamental principles of fair competition. What made Suzuka 1990 so enduring in the history of the sport was not just the collision itself, but the questions it raised, questions that continue to be debated decades later. And as the season came to an end, one thing was certain: the rivalry between Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost had produced one of the most intense and controversial chapters in Formula One history, a chapter that would define both of their legacies in ways that went far beyond statistics or championships. In the aftermath of Suzuka 1990, the conversation surrounding Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost extended far beyond the immediate result of the championship, evolving into a deeper analysis of what defines greatness in Formula One and how far a driver can go in the pursuit of victory. The incident forced fans, analysts, and even the drivers themselves to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of competition at the highest level, where the line between determination and excess is often blurred by the intensity of the moment. Senna's actions were interpreted in multiple ways, with some viewing them as the ultimate expression of a champion's mindset, a refusal to be placed in a vulnerable position again after what he experienced in 1989, while others saw the move as a calculated act that challenged the ethical boundaries of the sport. This division of opinion created a lasting debate that would follow both drivers throughout their careers, shaping how each of them would be remembered not only as competitors, but as symbols of different philosophies within racing. Alain Prost, known for his analytical and composed approach to racing, became the voice of those who believed that Formula One should remain governed by principles of control, precision, and respect for the limits of competition. emphasizing that winning should not come at any cost. His perspective highlighted the importance of consistency and strategic intelligence, qualities that had defined his career and earned him multiple championships. Senna, in contrast, embodied a more instinctive and emotionally driven philosophy, where racing was not just a technical discipline but also a deeply personal challenge, one that required total commitment and, at times, the willingness to accept risks that others would avoid. This fundamental difference in mindset was not created at Suzuka, but the events of 1990 brought it into sharp focus, presenting the world with two distinct interpretations of what it means to compete at the highest level of motorsport. As the years passed, the rivalry between Senna and Prost gradually transformed from active conflict into historical reference, but the significance of their battles remained central to the identity of Formula One, as a sport defined by both human and mechanical limits. The intensity of their competition set a benchmark for future generations, influencing how rivalries would be perceived and how drivers would approach moments of high pressure. Younger drivers studied their races, their decisions, and even their controversies, understanding that greatness in Formula One is often accompanied by moments that challenge conventional definitions of right and wrong. Suzuka 1990, in particular, became a case study, not just for its immediate impact, but for the way it encapsulated the complexity of elite competition, where decisions are made in fractions of a second but carry consequences that last for decades. For Ayrton Senna, the championship of 1990 represented both redemption and validation, a confirmation that he could overcome not only his competitors on track, but also the circumstances that he believed had worked against him in the past. Yet, even as he continued to achieve success in the following seasons, the memory of Suzuka remained an integral part of his narrative, a moment that revealed both his strengths and the controversial aspects of his competitive nature. For Alain Prost, the incident reinforced his identity as a driver who valued control and precision, but also marked a turning point in his relationship with the sport, as the intensity of the rivalry and the nature of its conclusion contributed to his eventual decisions regarding his career. In this way, Suzuka 1990 did not simply determine a champion. It influenced the trajectories of two of the greatest drivers in the history of Formula One. Perhaps what makes this moment so enduring is not the certainty of its interpretation, but the absence of a definitive answer, as each perspective reveals a different aspect of what it means to compete, to win, and to define success in an environment where the margins are incredibly small and the stakes are extraordinarily high. Some will always see Senna's move as an act of justified determination, shaped by the events of the previous year and the desire to ensure that the outcome would not be taken out of his hands again. Others will continue to view it as a step too far, a moment where the pursuit of victory compromised the principles that give the sport its integrity. This duality ensures that Suzuka 1990 remains relevant, not just as a historical event, but as an ongoing discussion about the values that underpin competitive sport. In the end, the story of Suzuka 1990 is not defined solely by the collision at the first corner, but by everything that led up to it and everything that followed, forming a narrative that captures the essence of Formula One at its most intense and most human. It is a story of rivalry, ambition, perception, and consequence, where two drivers, operating at the absolute limit of their abilities, made decisions that would shape not only a championship, but the way the sport itself is understood. And perhaps that is why, decades later, the moment still resonates, because it forces us to consider a question that has no simple answer. How far should a competitor go in order to win? And at what point does determination become something else entirely? Suzuka 1990 does not provide a conclusion, but it offers something more powerful, a lasting reminder that the greatest moments in sport are often the ones that leave us questioning, debating, and reflecting long after the race has finished.